Now, why did I choose this paper? I realized that I am very interested in biomedical literature as it relates to text mining. And there are plenty of papers within that topic of biological NLP, or natural language processing. I recently looked at a presentation on two different articles, the first by Zaremba and the second by Chen. And they both focused on the mining of abstracts. That's recently changed to a mining of the full text of an article. The paper was cited 91 times. That doesn't make it necessarily high in quality, it just means that it got a bit of attention. That attention was due to the fact that the paper characterizes differences between abstracts and bodies in very, very broad ways. We'll move on to the next slide. There are a few terms that I would like to talk about and explain before I move forward with the presentation. The first term is article, and we obviously know what that means, the entire contents of the article. That includes the abstract body and bibliography. The second term I'd like to define for us is full text, which you'll see referenced as FT, which is similar to an article, but it implies that the text is available. Some articles are simply a publication somewhere out there. It does not mean that it has the full text necessarily always. So we distinguish it that way. Now for abstract, it can include the title. When we're talking about bodies, we are talking about an article without the abstract, and sometimes without the bibliography as well. The last word is token, which is a linguistic unit, and most of the time it's just a word. It just means a word. Now the input and goals, if we move on to the next slide, the authors use the term craft, which is the Colorado richly annotated full text corpus. And there are 97 articles. Is that all of them? No, but it was mostly on mouse genomes, which did raise some concerns for me. Could it have been too specific or particular of a topic? Could it have caused any, false positives? I'm not necessarily sure. But the goal was to compare an article abstract and body from a journal article. And there were 4 different features. The first was structure, as well as morphosyntactic features. The third was entity distribution, and the last was differential performance. Now on the right of this slide, you'll see a graphic, and it's a column from the craft, and you can see how many different annotations there really are. You can see where they come up in different parts of the sentence and how they're handled. It's rather interesting. Now, if we move on to the next slide, we see that the past work is very, very dense, but does have the difference between abstract and bodies. So if we look at Shaw's work, what was found was that abstracts with denser entities are typically biological, but that does make sense because bodies are longer. Now, if we look at Corney's work, as well as Friedman's, they found that the majority of protein-protein interactions are actually within bodies and not mentioned within the abstract. And Lin found that the full texts can be searched for, but Agarwal tried to classify the sentences into article sections to find those significant pieces. So there's a lot of work that looks into very specific things, but the paper by Cohn tries to characterize the differences in more broad approaches. Sorry, next slide. The mining of full text articles. There's tons of work on mining, and we can see these references right here on my slide. We have Friedman, Rosetsky, and Harmston. Those 3 focused on the mining of full text pieces, and you can look into that further on your own if you're interested. But if we look at the next slide here, we have the sentence length. So they're comparing the length in sentences between abstracts and bodies. Now this is done by something called a Ling-Pipe sentence segmenter. And essentially, it cuts up the sentences after identifying the sentence as such. And it uses tokenization in order to count the tokens within each sentence. You can see the results are on the right side of this slide, but I would like you to focus more so on the bottom right graphic here. What this does is show you the captions, and they're the shortest, and obviously, because the speed of captioning is just the picture, but the shortest was abstracts, and the longest tend to be the discussion and results sections, which also makes sense, because discussion and results tend to be more conversational and meta, but the abstract has to be brief and short in as few terms as it can. Let's move on to the next slide here. Parenthesized text. I'm sure that there is... Now the next slide. Morphosyntactic features. I mean, that may sound really out there, so let's define it. We have form and order. And what they do is figure out how the sentences are formed and put the words in the correct order. And there are a few categories within these ideas. So we have conjunctions, which looks like and, but, or. Those are very tough to try and parse out. There's no real significance between the abstract and the bodies. Now, passive voice, you can see here it might look like the suffix ed by a person. Now, the reason that was counted is because there are different kinds of passive voice. And that example, something ed by, is a good example of that. Now, they are undercounted, which may not be a bad thing because they were found to be roughly equal. It wasn't necessarily a big deal between the abstracts and the bodies. Now there are negations, not, no, neither. Those occurrences were lower. Now for the pronomial anaphora, which is really just a fancy way to look at a reference to something else, that could be unclear, especially in computing. Oftentimes there are difficulties with trying to identify what something means. So say, for instance, I were to say I buy an HCTV, which is cool. Humans are easy to understand that what IT means, but a computer may have a difficult time with the term HTC Vive. Now if you look at table 4 here, you can see the differences between abstracts and bodies in the 4 categories. And that includes conjunctions, passive voice, negations, and pronomial anaphora. So you can look at how those intersected between abstracts and bodies. Very little significance for conjunctions. Passive voice did have a difference. Bodies did tend to have more passive voices than abstracts. And negations also had a significant difference. Bodies, again, had more negations. Now for pronomial anaphora, we see a very significant difference here between abstracts, who have them much more often. Now that may raise a question for you as to why that happens, but an abstract tries to be as concise as possible, so they tend to use more pronouns. Next slide is sentence complexity. So, hypothesis, which one is more complex? I went to the store to get food. Or this sentence, we traveled to the market to purchase calories. One sentence, the first one, seems to be a little bit more, or a little bit less complex, but they have the same word count. So it's very difficult to have a metric that can quantitate these kinds of things. If there's no real significant difference between the abstract and the body, what do we do? I mean, the measure may be weak, but the part of this article was not very clear as far as how sentence complexity comes into play, and I would like to see an improvement on that. Now, let's look at the different performances. Differential performances. Graphics. Slide? Well, duh. Abstracts and bodies are slide is a critique. So there are a few problems for me as far as this is concerned. The articles were all about mouse genomics. But what if those 10 articles had the same author? It's very, very likely. If you have the same writing style, it's not necessarily a good representation of all articles in publication or PubMed. So I would like to see more diversity. Maybe a small sample size. I mean, the references were fine, but the other interesting thing I noticed was that with Craft, there were 97 articles, but the website for Craft said that only 67 were included. So these conflicting numbers, 97, 67, brought me to email the author, and they said that 30 were not available to the public. Now, I mean, I understand that, but that does make it difficult for the public to actually get those results. May not be the best thing. And then finally here we have my references. Thank you very much for listening.